Some call it the grand deception of the century. The Tigray People Liberation Front, also known as TPLF, stole hundreds of millions of dollars of aid money intended for the starved people of Tigray. This shocking revelation gone underreported to protect governments, multi-billion-dollar humanitarian aid industry, celebrities, and prominent individuals. In November 2020, TPLF attacked Ethiopian army, triggering the civil war. It was a terrible miscalculation. Thousands killed, millions displaced, and the economic impact is in the billions. The TPLF's hope of advancing Addis Ababa and Asmara evaporated within weeks, and they resorted to Plan B, waging a propaganda campaign against Ethiopia using Western media, freelance journalists, pseudo-academics, and lobbyists. Barely weeks into the war, claims of weaponization of famine began to flood the Western media. Second-generation TPLF leaders ripped the page out of the 80s deception playbook, pulling off the same stunt and tactics to defraud and deceive the international community. Famine politics and aid money propelled TPLF into power in 1991. Why not doing it again in 2021?
The Ethiopian government is intentionally preventing food and other aid from reaching some of its people.
Hundreds of thousands in Tigray are starving. And as Nick...
Our next focus, civil war and the threat of a new famine in the African nation of Ethiopia. The fear that 1 million or more people could die of hunger in the coming months was enough to make President Reagan call for action.
Global leaders are raising alarm about widespread famine in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, but they're saying that this is a man-made disaster with food used as a weapon of war amid ethnic conflict.
State Department spokesman Charles Redmond.
A human catastrophe is unfolding in Ethiopia, where the government...
The truth is that access has been limited to but a trickle by the government of Ethiopia. Warehouses sit empty in Tigray because the government...
The United Nations is warning of a worsening humanitarian catastrophe in Ethiopia. On Friday, UNICEF said more than 100,000 children could face extreme starvation in the next year.
150,000 people are afflicted by famine, with millions more at risk.
Tigray People's Liberation Front is a 50-year-old liberation front that attempted to establish an independent republic of Tigray. It was an unknown rebel group until Gail Smith's reports widened their international profile. Gail's report on Christian Science Monitor in 1981 edition reads, "The biggest weakness of Tigrayan nationalists is the lack of external support." The long-awaited opportunity finally came in 1984. The Great Ethiopian Famine.
Michael Burke, the BBC reporter whose story brought this situation to the world's attention recently, has just returned from another
2010 BBC investigative report was earth-shattering. The report finds $95 million of aid money from Western governments and charities, including Band-Aid, was siphoned off by TPLF and spent on weapons. Band-Aid's accounts show that almost $11 million was given to the Relief Society of Tigray, humanitarian wing of TPLF. The declassified 1985 CIA document concluded that aid money was used to buy arms.
Now, a BBC investigation has found that millions of pounds were siphoned off by rebel groups to buy weapons. David Loyne has the details.
Former commander says that only 5% of $100 million in his area reached the starving. The rest went to buy weapons. As well as buying weapons, it's claimed that the money went to build up the political machine that took Meles Zenawi to power. He's still Prime Minister and would not speak to the BBC about these claims.
When Tigray was hit by the terrible famine, aid money was flowing to REST and through REST to the TPLF.
In 1990, 20 years before BBC investigative reports came out, two senior TPLF members, Gabriel Medin and Abraham Yaye, defected to the military government of Ethiopia and revealed and exposed the TPLF's deception on national television. But it was too late to make a difference.
በጣም ከሚያሳዝነኝ ነገር ድርቅ ለድርቅ ወይም በድርቅ ለተጎዱት የትግራይ ሰዎች የሚመጣው እርዳታ በገፍ የሚመጣው እርዳታ በካርቱን አይናችን እያየ ዘይቱ፣ በቆሎ፣ ስንዴው፣ ዱቄቱ፣ ጨርቁ ኑትሪሽስ የሆኑ ምግቦች ቫይታሚንስ ምናምን ያላቸው ብስኩቶች ለሱዳኖች ሲሸጡ አይተናል። በአይናችን ነው ያየነው። ፎቶግራፍ ተነስቶ በተለመነ ገንዘብ በተገኘ ሀብት ደግሞ ፓርቲ ነው የተመሰረተው።
ድርቁ ገንዘብ ጥቅልል ብሎ ለፖለቲካ ስራ ነው እና አንዱም ትልቁ የገቢ ምንጫቸው ይሄ ነው ማለት ነው። አልፎ አልፎ ደግሞ ሌሎች ነገሮች ዳታ እህል ሱዳን በጠራራ ፀሐይ በገበያ እየተሸጠ በካሽ ሲለወጥ ሰው በረሃብ ያልፋል። 10% 20% ከእርዳታው የትግራይ ህዝብ አግኝቶ እንደሆነ ማለት ኢንዲጂነስ የሆነው እርዳታውን የሚገባው ህዝብ አግኝቶ ከሆነ ታሪክ ይመሰክራል።
The rebels are attempting to build their own relief operation. On the outskirts of Kassala, the Relief Society of Tigray is running a mill where wheat donated by the International Red Cross is ground into flour.
The Great Ethiopian Famine prompted unprecedented international response and outpouring of the largest humanitarian assistance in human history. This caught the TPLF leaders' attention, a potential lucrative business opportunity. Top TPLF leaders hatched out and successfully carried out a fraudulent scheme to use TPLF's humanitarian relief wing called Relief Society of Tigray, aka REST for Humanitarian Aid Effort. TPLF officials managed to convince most NGOs that REST was a genuine charity and humanitarian organization, separated from the military wing of the TPLF. Given the catastrophic nature of the famine and the need to save lives, the international community ignored numerous warnings and red flags. It was common knowledge that the TPLF was as radical among radicals in the esoteric realm of third world communist insurgencies. U.S. government also designated the TPLF as a terrorist group until lifted in 1991. Here's a video of TPLF chairman Meles Zenawi asking for aid.
Why is it so desperate? Because the people that I am fighting for are dying because of lack of food. They are hardworking. The urgent need of feeding the people and the equally urgent need of
Tekelewini Asefa still serves as an executive director of REST.
We are getting so little help from the outside. Hundreds of thousands of Tigrayans are at a point of starvation. What we can do, because we have nothing food for them. I know the suffering will get worse. We heard from radio that Ethiopia is getting a lot of aid from outside. I know that our people won't get anything unless they send it through Sudan.
Here's how TPLF perpetrated the scam and exploited the charitable instinct and generosity of the international community. TPLF operatives posed as grain merchants and solicited business from NGOs in Sudan, where most of the aid effort was taking place. These merchants showed these NGOs a stockpile of grain in warehouses, which are owned by the TPLF. Payments would be made to the grain merchant, and it would be handed over to REST representatives. Guess what? The TPLF would keep the cash and the grain. Simple and sweet. This black and white photo from that time demonstrates the scheme effectively. Max Pepperdy, a charity worker from Christian Aid, carried nearly $500,000 opening a duffel bag full of cash, which is being counted by Gebre Medehin, the grain merchant, and Tekelewani Asefa, director of REST. Remember, both of them were TPLF operatives. Gebre Medin, now 75, shown here, says over 95% of the aid money spent on weapons. Former TPLF founder and commander Dr. Aregawi Berhe bait Gebre Medin's version of events. TPLF operatives were also approached NGOs for additional purchases of grain to famine victims located in inaccessible rebel-controlled areas of Tigray. Once the purchase is made, the TPLF will shuttle grains from one storage facility owned by the TPLF to another. With this method, TPLF were able to sell and resell the same grain multiple times, embezzling millions of dollars in the process. The 1985 New York Times article reads, quoting UN officials, delivering of emergency, food aid, and other relief supplies has significantly improved in the northern Ethiopian provinces. Gail Smith, who was an administrator of U.S. aid during the Obama administration, labeled the report absolutely false. Gail Smith, coordinator and consultant of Relief Society of Tigray, she said, about 3.8 million of Tigray's 5 million people were in need of assistance. Most of these victims are in rural areas of Tigray, controlled by anti-government forces. 80% of the province was under the control of the TPLF. The 80% claim was grossly exaggerated and misleading. Conservative estimates indicated that probably 20 to 30% might be under the control of the rebels. The number of famine victims was fabricated too, to about double the UN estimate. These kinds of unsubstantiated claims paved the way for TPLF to carry out unprecedented deception. We still don't know how many lives could have been saved had the money gone to the intended purpose.
Some other outside entity recognized the rebels as the moral equivalents of their founding fathers and secretly supplying them with arms. How are they achieving these victories?
Congressman, I appreciate your question very much. I've often asked the same questions, and it's hard sometimes to get a handle on it.
Tigray, they seem to be much stronger. How are they? I don't understand how they are getting so strong. Who's helping them?
Gail Smith, who is currently serving as COVID coordinator in Biden administration, was the coordinator and consultant of REST. We still don't know the extent of her knowledge about TPLF fraud and schemes. I like to borrow Senator Howard Baker's immortal line. What did Gail know, and when did she know it? Most humanitarian aid agencies and celebrities continue to deny the misuse of aid money. Relief Society of Tigray was the only distributor of aid in rebel-controlled areas of Tigray. This capacitated TPLF to recruit fighters by using food as a weapon, forcing desperate, starving Tigrayans to join the struggle to save their lives. A traumatic experience for many. The Ethiopian military government was using feeding stations to facilitate and expedite the relief effort. Drought victims were also relocated to fertile parts of Ethiopia. However, this move sent a shockwave in TPLF's camp. A guerrilla movement would not survive in a depopulated area. The TPLF had to act quickly. Nearly 400,000 severely malnourished, weak, and starving Tigrayans forced march to Sudan. Thousands died on the road. Some historians likened it to Nazis' death march in Second World War. Tigrayan people were used as pawns and human shields. That was one of the saddest chapters in human history.
The way the narrative of famine and aid has been used in this year of war literally makes me question everything I've ever known, including last time that Ethiopia, or that I think I've known, the last time that Ethiopian war and there were claims of famine. Like really, like when you see how blatant the lies are, like we know for a fact that the government was not blocking aid. Why? Because the Tigray leadership admitted to those 500 trucks coming in. I mean, when you think about 500 trucks, like
the government is implementing a policy of starvation, and it is a kind of a subtle genocide. Ethiopian government to oppose our people because they tried to military means to subdue our people, and it was not possible for them. Now they are doing it by cover of resettlement.
Especially after this trip and talking to the drought migrants, that the Ethiopian government intends to starve out a population that it has been unsuccessful in crushing militarily for the past almost 10 years.
The military authorities, essentially the junta, saw food shortage in Eritrea, Tigray, as a strategic weapon in their own hands. And they were quite prepared, as I suppose military authorities have been throughout history, quite prepared to use the enemy's shortage of supplies.
How many people were closer to an Ethiopian government camp but came here instead?
I spoke to many of your citizens who walked for 20 days, 30 days, 40 days. They said they were closer to government camps, but that they walked all the way towards the Sudan. Why would they be doing that?
No, I don't think so. I don't see why they would do that.
How many people have ever
Why they would do that?
How many people have ever been bombed or shot at by the Ethiopian government here?
I have heard people tell me stories about bombing and strafing by the Ethiopian Air Force, and they were really scared of the government, and that's why they walked so far to get towards the Sudan.
I don't think so. Well, people who cross the border to Sudan, well, they are sometimes obliged to create stories because they feel that they can get sympathy only if they tell some dramatic stories. But I can assure you, in terms of sincerity, we have tried even to distribute food even to the rebels themselves.
You know, the issue is when you're talking to refugees in Sudan, can they really tell you if something happened that was not favorable to TPLF officials, right? Could they really say that in that space and feel safe? Could people in Tigray tell you a story that did not just malign Ethiopian government, Ethiopian military or Eritrean military? Could they tell you something that actually went against the Tigray forces? I don't know that they can without risking their lives. I mean, even myself as an ethnic Tigrayan, asking some of these questions, I've dealt with a lot of backlash. And I'm here in the U.S. where I'm not at reach of, at least you would think, of TPLF officials, right? So, and I don't fully feel that freedom to be able to ask these questions. So when you think about the very poor people that are in that region or in the refugee
Ambassador to the United Nations, Berhanu Dinka. Mr. Ambassador, how do you respond to the basic charge in that report that your government is deliberately withholding food from most of the famine victims because they live in the two rebel provinces?
Well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. My reaction to the film that we've just seen is one of indignation, because the whole story is based on hearsay and allegations made by 2 or 3 individuals, namely Dan Connell, Chris Carter, and Mr. Elliott of the British Independent Aid.
All representatives of different independent aid organizations.
Aid organizations who have no, who are not participating in any manner in the assistance that's being given to Ethiopia. They are not operating in Ethiopia.
Those refugees who say the government is killing refugees. For example, many of them have been strafed from the air by your Air Force.
Now, as the commissioner, Ethiopian Commissioner for Relief and Rehabilitation, Mr. Dawit, was saying on this interview, these people who have gone to the Sudan or to other neighboring countries, it's very easy for anybody who wants to put anything into their mouth to coach them. For instance, if you had looked carefully at the film, when these people were asking them who have been bombed among you, or who have been close to Ethiopian shelter but prefer to come over here, without even the thing being interpreted into their language, the people were raising their hands. And in other interviews, it's always interpreted for them.
I think you say that report is totally false.
It's absolutely false, and if you give me enough time, I can tell you why it's false and who are doing this. And just to say, before I finish my sentence, the credible non-governmental organizations, the donor countries in Ethiopia, which are operating in Ethiopia, 39 different NGOs have seen this film in Addis Ababa last week, and they all denounced it as malicious.
Based on recently declassified CIA documents, there was an attempt to overthrow the Ethiopian government. CIA declassified document, titled Strictly Personal, April 1985. High-level source reported urgently he had reviewed top-secret document which showed White House, Defense Department, and CIA were planning a covert operation in Ethiopia. Ultimate objective, to unseat, if possible, dictator Mengistu Haile Mariam. Source says CIA was planning to use food shipment to starving Ethiopians as a cover to ship arms and supplies to rebels in the north. Prime Minister Thatcher's secret directives also declassified. The documents, marked top secret and personal and restricted to only 2 copies, asked Foreign Secretary Jeffrey to come up with ways to destabilize Ethiopia. Ex-CIA Paul Henze also spoke highly of Rest in the Senate hearing.
Relief Society of Tigray. They, I think, are far more conscious of this aspect of governance than Mengistu's government ever was. And I know of no example. TPLF, EPRDF have an excellent record over an extended period of time for welfare, famine relief, disaster relief operations among the populations of the areas they've had under their control. Each of these organizations has sponsored major relief organizations.
And that the UN and the international relief communities must address themselves to put additional pressure on the Ethiopians as well as the Soviet Union.
Because Ethiopia is a client state of the Soviet Union. They take their orders from the Soviet Union. At least 2 million people are now being held hostage by their own government. Food is being used as a political weapon. How inhumane can you get?
For subsidizing and supporting a communist dictatorship over there. We can't do much about that, but we should be putting pressure on them to...
An international campaign to isolate and, if necessary, to delegitimize the Mengistu dictatorship must be aimed. I've also met with the dictator Mengistu, and in fact, I guess I'm probably the only Republican that has, Mr. Chairman, since you and I were there. And I know there is no hope for Ethiopia as long as that gangster remains in power.
Nation status, banning Ethiopian coffee imports and prohibiting loans to Ethiopia. I want to commend the bill sponsor, Congressman Roth, for all of the hard work that he has done.
Roth-Gray bill, which would impose sanctions on Ethiopia. The Gray-Roth bill is the least we can do. If we're talking about imposing severe sanctions, as we did yesterday on South Africa, I mean a complete embargo on all products, no sales to or from South Africa events. If we're talking about going that far with South Africa, why in the world are we not talking about similar action to a country that is, it seems to me, inconceivable that we would be doing this to South Africa while at the same time we have been taking virtually no action toward the government of Ethiopia.
Some of them even equated Ethiopia with apartheid in South Africa. The irony being that Mandela received training in Ethiopia in the 60s. Prime Minister Endakachau Mekonnen at the UN summit denounced the racist apartheid government of South Africa.
South Africa's continuing defiance of the United Nations and her negative reply to the first approach by the UN Commission for Southwest Africa.
Here's a historical photo of Mandela and Patrice Lumumba with His Imperial Majesty of Haile Selassie. In 1991, the TPLF seized state power in Ethiopia, and REST was formally registered as an NGO. REST dominated and monopolized the delivery and distribution of aid for 27 years, amassed millions of dollars. Just to show one example, U.S. aid gave REST over $1.5 billion US dollars, distributed over the years of 2010, 2012, 2013, and 2015. Given the history of TPLF, more oversight was warranted. In the summer of 1995, the TPLF established the business arm of the party, Endowment Fund for the Rehabilitation of Tigray, or EFFORT. WikiLeaks cables by Donald Yamamoto, former U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia, concludes that the initial capital for EFFORT came from Relief Society of Tigray. CIA noted that the TPLF had received huge amounts of international assistance, particularly from the United States, throughout the 1980s. 1991, the TPLF had roughly $100 million liquidated. This is just the official number. It's obviously more than that. EFFORT is a secretive business conglomerate. Only TPLF executive and central committee members can be CEO. Prime Minister Meles Zenawi's wife Azeb was once the CEO of EFFORT.
መለስ ከመሰዋቱ በፊት የ5 ዓመት የትግራይ ኢንዱስትሪ በኤፈርት እንዴት መፈጸም እንዳለበት የጻፈው ስትራቴጂ ነበር።
EFFORT benefited from preferential policies, tax waivers, custom relief, tax breaks, and access to loans from state-owned financial institutions with little or no collateral. EFFORT's growth was very stunning, owning a chain of 65 multi-billion-dollar business firms dominating every sector of Ethiopia's economy, including agriculture, industry, banking, mining, import-export, transport, construction, insurance, and communications. As a result of unfair competition with party-owned business, many private industries bankrupted and went out of business. EFFORT has never been audited. Moreover, the blurred lines between TPLF, the public and private businesses, making it difficult to trace the money. EFFORT may have stashed over $30 billion in Western banks and secretive offshore companies. Ethiopia's economy, politics, security, and military was dominated by TPLF from 1991 to 2019. It's extremely difficult to understand and quantify the magnitude and scale of the economic crime. According to Global Financial Integrity website, from 2004 to 2013, Ethiopia lost $26 billion due to illicit financial outflow. The stolen money in the 80s gave rise of business conglomerate effort, plundering Ethiopia for a quarter century and now financing the ongoing civil war in Ethiopia. Days after the war started, the stolen money put into action, waging successive PR attacks on Ethiopia. Western media echo chamber tried their best to isolate Ethiopia, using unverified claims of genocide, atrocity, and famine, creating the condition for humanitarian intervention. Recently, Admiral James Stavridis wrote an article calling for intervention.
Undercover in the Horn of Africa. Posing as tourists, Newsnight and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism travelled to Ethiopia to look into mounting allegations of human rights abuses. We revealed evidence of children dying of hunger. Aid used as a weapon of oppression to starve the opposition into submission. 20 years of mass arrests, extrajudicial killings and rape.
Harmela Aragawi, a journalist of ethnic Tigrayan descent working for CBS News in Los Angeles, exposed the TPLF's frauds and deceptions.
In the beginning of the war, my mom happened to be in that region. She lived in the States for 26 years and had gone back as a PhD chemist to help the university in Mekelle do some research. So I was particularly invested because of the communication blackout, and I was really trying to do as much as I can, work with humanitarian so-called activists, which ultimately ended up being pro-TPLF activists. So I'm very much aware how the information gets through. Literally, activists get a picture or a video or information from TPLF officials there who have satellite connections. And that is what makes it into CNN and makes it into New York Times. CNN's Nima El-Bagir, who I've had the chance to talk to once when I was considering potentially going to the refugee camps in Sudan. She's very close with the head of who's a TPLF member himself. A lot of the contacts that she wanted to give me to get information on Sudan were literally TPLF affiliated folks. So
we call for the Abe administration to create an independent commission to investigate the racketeering, money laundering, corruption, illicit financial flows, and other economic crimes committed by the TPLF. The Biden administration should stop supporting the small minority group of oligarchs and kleptocrats that are wreaking havoc in East Africa. Ethiopians protested over 31 cities around the world. No more deception, no more treachery, no more betrayal, no more lies. 50 years is enough.